Beneath Chicago's modern skyscrapers, wide boulevards, and magnificent architecture lies a dark secret that official history has carefully covered up, an intact urban layer discovered and systematically concealed during the street elevation projects of 1874. The story told to us in our schools, universities, and official histories is simple. Chicago was a primitive settlement consisting of little more than a small trading post in the 1830s, grew rapidly in the 1850s, and was completely rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1871. However, the truth that emerged during the elevation projects of the 1870s shatters this clean and orderly narrative. According to the official account, Chicago was built on swampland along the shores of Lake Michigan and suffered from chronic sewage problems. Muddy streets, health threats, and floods had virtually paralyzed the city, so engineers decided to raise the entire city by elevating the street level by 3 to 4 meters. Buildings would be lifted with jacks, new foundations filled underneath them, and thus a modern, hygienic city would be created. This narrative is presented as a logical and technological triumph story, but the reality that construction workers encountered was completely different. When excavations began, instead of the expected simple basements or remnants of wooden shacks, workers encountered an urban landscape frozen in time, crystallized. In central areas such as State Street, Michigan Avenue, and South Water Street, the scene revealed when layers of mud and soil were removed was astonishing. Intact storefronts with unbroken glass, furniture and commercial goods still in place inside, and shop signs clearly readable. The shelves behind these windows were still stocked with products, account books, cash registers, and traces of daily commerce lay on the counters. It was as if shop owners had left their businesses one day and never returned, as if a sudden and unexpected catastrophe had sealed this entire urban layer in an instant. Even more surprising was the architectural quality and construction technique of these structures. Official history tells us that Chicago in the 1870s was still a primitive frontier trading center only 20 to 30 years old, claiming that most buildings were built of wood, hastily and temporarily. However, the structures found underground definitively contradict this story. The buildings found in the excavations were not wooden shacks, but permanent commercial structures built of brick and stone to last for generations. The foundations and facades of these buildings display craftsmanship far beyond the crude carpentry skills of that era, featuring precise stonework and sophisticated architectural details. Window arches, door frames, and decorative elements reflected an architectural tradition that was the product of centuries of experience. This was not something a supposed 3-decade-old frontier town could produce. Even more intriguing was the discovery that some buildings actually had their second and third floors beneath the current New Street level. This showed that the uncovered structures were not just single-story shops, but rather complex, multi-story commercial complexes. It proved that Chicago had a much deeper architectural foundation, a much more rooted urban past than assumed. Perhaps the greatest anomaly from a geological and engineering perspective was the uniformity of this burial event. In different parts of the city, in different neighborhoods, all buildings said to have been constructed at different times were found beneath a layer of mud at almost exactly the same depth. The burial depth of a building on State Street was surprisingly identical to that of another building on Michigan Avenue. This uniformity was not something that could be explained by a natural geological event, because natural subsidence, flood accumulation, or swamp formation processes show irregular, disproportionate, and regional differences. Yet the buried layer in Chicago was as straight as a ruler line, as if created by deliberate and planned filling. Indeed, there was strong evidence that in some areas the mud had clearly not accumulated naturally, but rather the old layer had been covered densely and systematically with clean fill, material to quickly conceal it. This filling operation had disrupted the natural ordering of geological layers, leading to organic materials being found at unexpected depths and contradictory carbon dating results. It was as if someone had hastily, yet methodically, wanted to hide old Chicago beneath a new ground level. Another shocking discovery during the 1874 elevation work was the encounter with an already existing advanced tunnel network. Official records state that Chicago's famous freight tunnels were built in the 1890s to meet railroad and logistics needs. However, workers in 1874 encountered advanced tunnel corridors already present, equipped with ventilation and drainage systems. These tunnels were not primitive, but rather structures requiring professional planning and engineering knowledge. Their walls were built with solid brick, their ceilings were arched, and some had brackets for torches and ventilation shafts. This infrastructure could be considered part of an older, more complex urban order that existed before Chicago was officially founded. So what did authorities do when all these findings came to light? This is where the story transforms from scientific curiosity into a narrative preservation operation. The 1874 project was not just an engineering endeavor, but also a historical sealing operation. The buildings in the most solid condition and architecturally most advanced, that is, those that most questioned official history, were quickly buried under new foundations on the pretext of not delaying the construction schedule, rather than being examined, documented, or preserved in detail. Workers were told to cover them over and continue rather than dismantling and removing the old structures. The detailed reports kept at the beginning of the project, photographs showing buried buildings, and engineer notes documenting discoveries were eventually deleted from municipal archives or reclassified as old construction waste. Today, when you look at documents related to the 1874 project in the Chicago History Museum or municipal archives, you largely encounter technical jack operations, photographs of elevated buildings, and success stories. But there is almost no reference to what was found underground, those intact storefronts, those advanced tunnels. This silence is not coincidental, but a deliberate choice. Because if Chicago had truly risen from a place consisting of little more than a small trading post in the 1830s, it would be impossible for sophisticated, permanent, multi-story commercial buildings and advanced tunnel networks to exist underground in the 1870s. These findings indicate that Chicago has a much older history, a much more rooted civilization, perhaps that an advanced settlement existed there long before the founding date we know today. And if this is true, then the settlement history of North America, the arrival of European immigrants, and the continent's wild, empty lands narrative must be seriously questioned. That is why what was done in 1874 was not just razing the streets, but forever burying in darkness those storefronts of that old and sophisticated Chicago beneath our feet. This disturbing truth. In summary, Chicago did not rise from zero on a muddy plain. Rather, it was built upon the post-catastrophe remains of a permanent and highly planned city that was already there, and the clean, linear progress story that modern history tells us is actually nothing more than a thin veil covering countless questions, countless hidden truths,